My name is Hannah Pierce. I am 20 years old, and for as long as I can remember, Christmas has been the one day I kept hoping might feel different. I wanted to believe that the lights, the tree, the gifts, maybe even the smell of turkey in the oven, could cover over the cracks in my family. I drove home that morning with a box of cookies I had baked myself, whispering that this year they would finally see me. But once I stepped inside, I realized some things don't change no matter how much you wish they would. And before the night was over, my parents said words to me no daughter ever expects to hear. What happens when a family holiday turns into the moment that shatters everything you thought you knew? Stay with me because this story is one you will not forget. Let me take you back to where it began. I pulled into my parents' driveway on Christmas morning, the tires crunching over fresh snow that had fallen overnight. The neighborhood looked like something out of a postcard, with twinkling lights strung across rooftops and kids' snowmen standing guard in front yards. For a second, I let myself believe maybe this year would be different, that maybe I would walk into warmth instead of feeling like an outsider. The Pierce house stood there, same pale blue siding, same wreath hanging on the door, smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the smell of roasted turkey floated out even before I opened the door. My arms ached a little from carrying the tin of cookies I had baked the night before. A simple gift, I thought, might add something sweet to the day. Inside the living room, the Christmas tree nearly touched the ceiling, covered in ornaments collected over the years, some handmade, some shiny and store-bought. Wrapped boxes in gold and red paper crowded underneath. For a moment, it really did feel magical, like when I was a child staring wide-eyed at the lights. Then voices drifted in from the kitchen, and that old tight feeling in my chest returned. I stepped in quietly, balancing the cookie tin. At the kitchen island sat my mom Margaret with a glass of wine in hand, her hair styled perfectly, face glowing with excitement. Beside her stood my dad Daniel, in his usual pressed shirt, even on a holiday, leaning on the counter with a proud smile. And at the center of their attention, as always, was Olivia, my older sister, in a fitted red dress that matched her lipstick. They were laughing together, words tumbling over each other. I cleared my throat and said softly that I was home. My mom glanced my way with a quick nod, then turned right back to Olivia. My dad didn't even look up from the glass he was refilling. Olivia finally turned her head, her expression polite but distracted. She said, "Hey," noticed the tin in my hands, and asked if those were cookies. I nodded, placing them on the counter. I told them I had stayed up late to make them, hoping they would like them. Olivia gave a small shrug and went right back to where she had left off in her story. She lifted her glass, her smile widening. She told them she had news that her boss had officially promoted her to regional marketing director and that she would be taking over campaigns in Portland. My mom gasped, clapping her hands together. My dad straightened, his whole face lighting up with pride. He pulled Olivia into a hug, saying how proud he was, how he always knew she would get there. My mom's eyes shone as if Olivia had just won a crown. They started talking over one another, planning celebrations, asking about bonuses, laughing about how this would open new doors. I stood there at the edge of the counter, my hands folded in front of me, my heart thudding with a mix of dread and longing. The cookie tin sat unopened right where I had placed it. The sweet smell of cinnamon and sugar felt out of place against the sharp tang of champagne in their glasses. I pressed a smile onto my face, even though it felt heavy. I told myself not to make a scene, not to break the fragile joy in the room, even if none of it seemed to belong to me. I thought maybe once the excitement about Olivia's promotion slowed down, someone might turn to me and ask how school was going, or if I had eaten breakfast yet, or even just if I was doing all right. But the moment never came. My dad raised his glass to Olivia again and said she was the pride of the family. My mom leaned in close to her, whispering something I couldn't catch, both of them laughing like best friends. I stared at their faces glowing in the warm kitchen light, and I felt myself fading into the background the same way I had for as long as I could remember. I shifted my weight, hoping the sound of my boots on the tile might draw attention. No one looked up. I picked at the edge of my sweater sleeve, the wool catching under my nail. For a second, I thought about announcing the small art show I had put together at the university, earlier in December, how more than 100 people had come, how the local paper had run a tiny column about it. But standing there, listening to Olivia's voice fill the room, I knew it would sound like nothing in comparison. The laughter swelled again, the clink of glasses louder than anything I could have said. I let my shoulders drop, forcing another smile, even though my throat felt tight. The Christmas lights blinked on the tree behind me, casting soft patterns on the floor, but none of it felt warm. It felt like I had walked into a stage already set where my role was to stand silently in the wings. I stepped back slightly, leaning against the doorway, watching them celebrate as if I wasn't even there. Olivia's voice rang out confident, assured, while mine stayed lodged inside, unspoken. That was the moment I realized the day was already decided. No matter how many cookies I baked or how many miles I drove to be there, I would always be the extra guest in my own family's home. We drifted into the dining room when my mom called out that everything was ready. The table stretched almost the length of the room, covered with a deep red runner crystal glasses, catching the light of the candles she had lit in silver holders. China plates with little holly patterns were stacked at each place, and the smell of turkey and sage stuffing made the air feel heavy. My dad slipped into the chair at the head of the table as though he were presiding over a board meeting. He straightened his fork, aligned his glass, and cleared his throat before anyone else could sit down. Olivia slid into the seat at his right, smiling as she smoothed her dress. My mom hovered behind her, pouring a generous glass of wine and adjusting Olivia's napkin like she was hosting an honored guest. I found my place 2 seats from the end, a spot that always seemed reserved for me. The distance felt symbolic, and maybe it was. Ethan arrived a few minutes later, brushing snow off his jacket, his cheeks flushed from the cold. He leaned down to hug Mom, then clapped Dad on the shoulder in a way that only sons can get away with. He sat directly across from me, his grin wide, as he started telling them how good Denver had been treating him. As dishes began to pass around the table, the rhythm of conversation naturally shifted to Ethan. He spoke with easy confidence about the new construction project his firm had secured, describing contracts worth millions, and how he was managing crews of hundreds. He told them about the groundbreaking next month, and how the mayor himself was expected to attend. My dad leaned forward, his eyes bright with pride, nodding as if each word confirmed his own legacy. My mom smiled so warmly at Ethan that you would think he had invented steel beams himself. Olivia jumped in, congratulating him, asking sharp questions about budgets and design, as though she were his business partner. I spooned mashed potatoes onto my plate, the steam fogging my glasses for a moment. My hands felt clumsy as I tried to decide when to speak. I knew if I stayed silent, the whole meal would pass without anyone remembering I was there. So I waited for a natural pause, that brief lull when glasses were being refilled and forks scraped against plates. I set my fork down and said that earlier in December, I had organized a student art show at the university. I told them that more than 100 people had attended, some of them strangers who had never seen my work before, and that the Star Tribune had even printed a small feature with my name. For a second there was silence, and I thought, maybe I had finally done something that would make their eyes turn toward me with pride. Instead, my mom let out a little laugh, the kind you use when a child is pretending to be important. She said I had always loved to put on performances and that I didn't need an audience to feel special. She told me it was better to be satisfied without showing off. The words cut so quickly I barely had time to put up a shield. I felt my face grow warm and I pressed my hands together under the table to keep from fidgeting. I tried to explain softly that it wasn't about the crowd, that people had connected with the paintings, and that it had been meaningful. Before I could finish, my dad lifted his hand palm out the way he would in meetings when someone needed to stop talking. He said it was fine for me to have hobbies, but I needed to understand that they weren't on the same level as real achievements. He glanced toward Olivia and Ethan, listing off Olivia's new promotion in Portland and Ethan's project shaping the Denver skyline. He said that those were accomplishments that mattered, things that built futures. The air in the room seemed to collapse. My fork trembled when I reached for it again. Olivia glanced at me quickly, then looked down at her plate, hiding what might have been a smirk. Ethan shifted in his chair, focusing intently on his green beans, as though they were the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. The turkey sat in front of me, golden and steaming, but I had no appetite left. My mom leaned across the table, her attention fixed on Olivia again, asking what the timeline for her move to Portland would be, and whether she would get to travel internationally with the new position. Olivia spoke with the kind of energy that drew everyone in her voice, clear, her gestures confident. I sat quietly, moving food around my plate, nodding when someone glanced my way, though no one asked me another question. The clinking of glasses, the sound of laughter, all of it swirled together until it felt like I was sitting in the middle of a celebration that had no place for me. I thought of the cookie tins still unopened on the counter, the sugar crystals I had sprinkled so carefully the night before. I imagined them growing stale while my family filled themselves on turkey and compliments. My dad raised his glass again, toasting Olivia's future, and Ethan's success, his words heavy with pride. He didn't mention me, not once. I chewed a small bite of potato that tasted like paste and forced myself to swallow. My chest tightened, the weight of being invisible pressing down harder than ever. The candles flickered shadows, dancing across the faces of my family as they laughed and traded stories, their voices overlapping in a harmony I was never part of. I thought about speaking again, about insisting that my art show had mattered, that it had been something real. But the words died before they reached my lips. My dad had already moved on, asking Ethan about contracts, Olivia about her new team, my mom about holiday travel plans she wanted to arrange around their schedules. I pressed my napkin into my lap, the fabric stiff beneath my fingers. My stomach churned, and still I smiled, faintly, pretending I belonged, pretending I didn't care, pretending I couldn't hear the echo of my dad's hand cutting me off, my mom's laugh, dismissing me, Olivia's eyes glittering with satisfaction. By the time dessert was mentioned, I felt like the walls were closing in. I reached for my glass of water, the coolness of it grounding me, but it did nothing to ease the hollowness spreading inside. I stared at the table, the glint of the silverware, the perfect symmetry of the place settings, and wondered how a scene so beautiful could feel so cruel. I told myself to breathe, to keep my face steady. I told myself not to let them see how much it hurt, but deep down I knew they already knew. They just did not care. My dad shifted in his chair and lifted his glass, his voice rising above the chatter, as he declared a toast to Olivia. He said they were all gathered to celebrate her, to honor her promotion, and to look forward to the kind of future she was destined for. Everyone raised their glasses in unison, the clinking sound echoing in the dining room. Smiles spread around the table like warmth from the fire, but none of it reached me. My name wasn't spoken, not even as an afterthought. I touched the stem of my water glass, cool against my fingers, and watched as Olivia accepted their praise with practiced grace. She tilted her head, feigned modesty, and let out a soft laugh that seemed to charm them even more. My mom leaned in close to her, brushing invisible crumbs from Olivia's sleeve, her eyes shining with pride. Ethan lifted his own glass, murmuring something about being proud of his sister. I sat there with my hands folded, invisible, the water in front of me trembling slightly, as if it absorbed the pounding of my heart. The laughter faded just long enough for my dad to clear his throat again. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his stomach, the way he did when he wanted everyone's attention. His face shifted from celebratory to reflective, almost solemn, and for a moment, I thought he might finally include me in his words. Instead, he said, there was something he had carried for a long time, something he thought was worth saying out loud. His voice was calm, steady, rehearsed, even like a speech he had given himself many times before. He said that, if he was being honest, having a third child had been a mistake. It was too much for them, and it had changed everything in ways they regretted. The words dropped like stones into silence. For a heartbeat, I thought I had misheard him. My mom's fork scraped against her plate as she lowered her eyes, avoiding mine. She did not correct him, did not soften the blow, only shifted in her seat, as if the truth had simply been spoken, and she had no energy to challenge it. Olivia's lips curved into the faintest smile, not cruel but satisfied, her eyes flicking to me and then back to her plate. Ethan swallowed hard, adjusted his napkin, and looked anywhere but in my direction. The ringing in my ears grew louder, drowning out the hum of conversation. The words repeated themselves, circling in my mind. Regret. Mistake. Too much. My chest tightened, my throat ached, but no sound came out. I wanted to ask why they had let me grow up, believing I belonged, when all along I had been their burden. I wanted to scream that I had spent years trying to earn even a fraction of the love they gave so freely to Olivia and Ethan. Instead, I sat frozen, my eyes stinging, my hands gripping the glass as though it might anchor me. The stem slipped beneath my damp fingers. My water glass tipped and fell, shattering against the hardwood floor. The sharp crack split the silence, water spreading quickly across the boards, shards scattering like broken ice. I jolted to my feet, my chair scraping loudly behind me. For a second, no one moved. Then my mom sighed as if I had knocked over a salt shaker. She dabbed at her skirt where a single drop had landed and said nothing else. Olivia smirked, shaking her head slightly, her voice dripping with amusement as she muttered that I was always so dramatic. My dad glanced down at the mess, barely irritated, and told me flatly to be more careful next time. I crouched down, gathering the pieces with shaking hands, the edges glinting under candlelight. A shard sliced my thumb, and a bead of blood welled up bright and hot. I hissed, quietly pressing the corner of my napkin against it, but no one reached to help. My mom turned her attention back to Olivia, asking about the details of her new office. Ethan cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably, but said nothing. On the floor, surrounded by glass, I felt like a child again, kneeling in the shadow of people who pretended not to see me. I placed the shards carefully on the table, a pile of evidence of how fragile I had become in their presence. The blood on my thumbs spread through the fabric of the napkin, a small but undeniable stain. I sat back in my chair, slowly, my chest hollow. The turkey sat untouched on my plate, the cranberry sauce congealing at the edges. The clinking of forks and the hum of conversation started again, as though nothing had broken, nothing had been said. My dad leaned toward Olivia, asking when her official move to Portland would take place. My mom wanted to know if the company would pay for her travel. Their voices overlapped, warm, animated, alive. I stared down at my empty glass, now in pieces, and felt the last threads of hope unraveling. The air smelled of sage and butter, but it turned bitter in my mouth. Candlelight shimmered against the window, reflecting a family that looked perfect from the outside, while inside it was fractured beyond repair. I thought of every birthday where my cake had been smaller, every graduation where the applause had been quieter, every holiday where my gift had been an afterthought. I thought of the countless times I had convinced myself that maybe it was in my head, maybe I was too sensitive. But sitting there listening to my father calmly say he regretted my existence, I knew it had never been in my head. It had always been the truth. I pressed the napkin harder against my thumb, the sting grounding me. I wanted to stand and walk out, but my legs felt like stone. I stayed rooted in that chair, surrounded by laughter that did not include me, the sound of my dad's voice, praising Olivia, my mom, chiming in with pride, Ethan occasionally adding a word to keep the flow going. The room glowed with the warmth of Christmas, the tree lights blinking just beyond the doorway, and yet I had never felt colder in my life. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the hard wood louder than I meant. My voice came out thin, as I said I needed some air. No one looked up except Ethan, who gave me a quick, uncertain glance before lowering his eyes back to his plate. My mom adjusted the serving spoon in the sweet potatoes, Olivia sipped her wine, and my dad was already leaning toward her again, asking about company perks. I stepped into the hallway, the air cooler and quieter, but not enough to calm the storm in my chest. The house smelled like pine and cinnamon, scents I used to associate with comfort. Now they wrapped around me like smoke, cloying and heavy. My feet carried me toward the family photo wall almost without thought, as if some part of me had been waiting to face it. The wall stretched along the hallway, lined with frames of all sizes. My fingers brushed the edges of polished wood and metal as my eyes scanned each one. Olivia's wedding photo hung in the center, her white gown glowing under the photographer's lights, her husband's hand clasped proudly around hers. Next to it was Ethan at his college graduation cap and gown, Chris, my parents, standing on either side with proud smiles. There was a snapshot from last summer, the whole family at a lake house, all except me. They were lined up on a dock with sunglasses and tans, arms around each other. I remembered receiving the group text after the fact, an image already complete without me. I stepped closer, my throat tightening. Further down were childhood photos, Olivia holding a spelling bee trophy, Ethan with a science fair project. A family Christmas from 10 years ago, the tree in the background smaller but their smiles larger. My gaze searched for myself for evidence that I had been there too. The space where my high school graduation photo once hung was bare. A rectangle of cleaner paint marked the outline, surrounded by faint dust, the absence louder than any picture could be. I remembered that day, the crooked cap on my head, my dad's arm heavy around my shoulders. I remembered thinking even then that maybe this photo would finally be the one where I looked like I belonged. Now it was gone. I pressed my hand against the wall, the coolness of the paint against my palm, anchoring me as my knees threatened to give. My teeth bit down on my lip hard enough that I tasted metal, anything to keep the tears from spilling over. The silence of the hallway felt deafening, a contrast to the laughter echoing faintly from the dining room. I drew in a shaky breath, forcing my feet to move. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, slipping it on with stiff fingers. The scarf I had worn that morning was still damp with melted snow. I wound it around my neck quickly, my movements sharp. My keys jingled in my hand, each sound a small burst of courage. When I opened the front door, the cold air hit me instantly, sharp against my cheeks. The night outside was alive, with Christmas lights strung across porches and trees, glowing in reds, greens, and whites. Neighbors' houses looked cheerful, filled with voices and music drifting faintly into the street. I walked down the steps slowly, each crunch of snow under my boots loud in the quiet. Behind me, the house remained warm and bright, but it felt like a place that no longer had any room for me. I unlocked my car with trembling hands and slid inside the leather seat, freezing against my legs. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the glowing windows of the home I had grown up in. The muffled sound of laughter carried through the walls, reaching me even from the driveway. I imagined them lifting their glasses again, celebrating Olivia, asking Ethan about his next project. The image of the bare patch on the photo wall seared into my mind. I started the engine, the low rumble filling the still night. The headlights cut across the snow, catching the sparkle of icicles hanging from the eaves. My hands tightened around the wheel as I pulled out slowly, the tires crunching over the ice. As I turned onto the street, the lights of other houses flickered past, cheerful displays of snowmen and Santa figures waving from lawns. Each house looked warm, and inviting, families gathered inside, but to me it all felt like a world I had been shut out of. The colors blurred together through the wetness in my eyes. I drove through the neighborhood at a steady pace, past children playing in the snowbanks, past couples carrying gifts from car to front doors. To them, Christmas was laughter and love. For me, it was a hollow echo, a reminder of what I could never reach. The further I went, the smaller the house behind me became, until it disappeared into the dark, its glowing windows swallowed by distance. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, the cold night stretching before me, the decorations of strangers, the only light guiding me forward. When I finally pulled into the lot outside my apartment building, the night felt heavier than the snow clouds above. The world was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the faint jingle of a neighbor's wind chime. I sat in the car for a long moment, gripping the wheel, watching my breath fog the windshield. The warmth of the heater brushed my face, but could not reach the chill inside my chest. I gathered the tin of cookies from the passenger seat, still sealed tight, not a crumb touched. The ribbon I had tied with care that morning now felt like an insult. My boots crunched against the icy pavement as I climbed the stairs, each step echoing too loudly in the silence of the building. Inside my apartment, the air was still carrying the faint smell of coffee grounds from that morning. The string of lights I had hung along the window blinked softly, trying to create cheer, but the room felt more like a stage set than a home. I placed the cookies on the counter untouched, just as they had been in my parents' kitchen. I hung my coat on the rack, my scarf sliding loose and brushing against my cheek. It was the same green wool scarf my mom had given me back in 2019, handed over without words after an argument we never resolved. I pulled it tighter around my neck for a second, before draping it carefully on the hook beside my door. It looked out of place hanging there alone. I walked to the middle of the room, too restless to sit on the couch, too tired to stand still. Finally, I lowered myself onto the floor, crossing my legs, staring at the quiet walls. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence like a steady clock. My eyes drifted to the bottom drawer of my dresser, the one I rarely touched. My chest tightened. I rose slowly and opened it, the wood creaking softly. Inside lay my old journals, stacked unevenly edges, frayed covers decorated with stickers I had loved as a child. I picked up the thickest one, the purple cover faded, the spiral bent from years of being shoved into backpacks. Dust clung to my fingers as I carried it to the floor and opened it. The handwriting on the first pages was large and uneven, written in purple gel pen that had long since bled into the paper. The words caught my breath. Someday I will be important enough for Mom and Dad to love me. Someday they will be proud. My hand trembled as I traced the lines. Memories rushed back of being 10 years old, sitting on the floor of my bedroom with this journal, listening to Olivia's laughter drift down the hallway as Mom braided her hair for a school dance. Dad had been downstairs quizzing Ethan on math problems, telling him he would make a fine engineer one day. I had written those words that night because I had no one to tell them to. Page after page, I found pieces of myself I had forgotten. Notes about art projects I had been excited about, small victories at school, moments when I had tried to earn their attention. Each one ended with the same refrain. Maybe next time they will notice. The letters blurred through my tears. I pressed the book to my chest, the edges digging into my arms as sobs ripped through me before I could stop them. My whole body shook, years of swallowed words spilling out in the only place they had ever been safe. The sound filled the apartment, raw and lonely, bouncing off the bare walls. I wiped at my face with the back of my hand, but the tears kept coming, hot and relentless. I buried my face in the scarf, breathing in its faint scent of cedar that had never quite faded. It felt cruel that even the one gift she had given me carried both comfort and pain. For a long time I sat on the floor, my journal against my chest, rocking slightly, as if to soothe myself. I whispered that I was done, that I would not walk back into that house, not again, not ever. The words were quiet, but final. They hung in the air of the apartment like a vow. I closed the journal carefully, sliding it back into the drawer, but the words inside clung to me. The apartment was still the same. The blinking lights still tried to glow. The cookies still sat untouched on the counter. Yet everything felt altered, as if a curtain had finally lifted, and the truth could no longer be hidden. When I finally rose from the floor, my legs unsteady, I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table. The cut on my thumb from earlier stung as I gripped the glass, a small reminder of the shards I had picked up while they ignored me. I stared at the band of red beneath the skin and thought it was fitting. Invisible wounds had always been part of me tonight. They just decided to show themselves. I glanced toward the scarf one last time, its green wool catching the faint glow of the lights. And I knew the next Christmas would not find me in that house. I whispered the promise again, steady this time. I will not go back. The sun came in pale through the blinds, the kind of winter light that looked cold even when it touched my skin. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence that had wrapped itself around me since I got home the night before. I reached for it with heavy hands and saw Nora's name flash across the screen. She had sent a simple message asking how Christmas had gone, followed by a heart, the kind of shorthand between friends that carried more weight than a dozen questions. I stared at the words for a long time before typing back that it had been worse than I expected. I told her I had left early, that I had cried more in one night than I had in months. Her reply came quick, almost as if she had been waiting with the phone in her hand. She said she was sorry, but she wasn't surprised. She told me not to go back, not to keep trying to earn something that wasn't there. I sat up in bed, the blanket pooling around my waist, reading her words over and over. They steadied me in a way my own thoughts could not. Still, part of me resisted, that stubborn corner of my heart that always wanted to believe maybe next time would be different. I typed back that it felt wrong to cut them off completely, that they were my family after all. Nora called me instead of replying. Her voice came through the line steady and familiar, and I felt my throat tighten at the sound of it. She said she understood the pull, that she had felt it too. She reminded me of something I had forgotten, or maybe something she had never told me in detail. She said that when she was growing up, her brother Mark had been the star. He played varsity basketball, got straight A's without much effort, and their parents treated him like he was the center of gravity in their home. She remembered once bringing home a painting she had worked on for weeks, the colors layered carefully, the image of their old farmhouse glowing on the canvas. She showed it to her mom, waiting for even a small smile, but her mom only said she hoped Mark's game that night would go well. Her voice dipped lower as she told me about the night she overheard her dad on the phone, telling a friend that raising 2 kids was a lot, but at least they had Mark to be proud of. She had been 12, sitting on the stairs, with her knees pulled to her chest, hearing her worth measured and dismissed in a single breath. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, my own memories overlapping with hers, like 2 songs playing at once. I could almost see her sitting there on those stairs, her heart breaking the same way mine had in that dining room. Nora said it had taken her years to stop chasing their approval, years to realize that no amount of effort could balance the scales when the deck was stacked from the beginning. She told me she didn't want me to waste that same time. I wiped at my face, surprised to find tears again, but they were different from the night before. They were softer, less frantic, almost like a release. I told her it felt like I was watching my life from the outside, that everything I had thought I could fix had been an illusion. She let the silence sit for a beat, then said gently that I wasn't alone. That was the thing she wanted me to know. I wasn't the only one who had been made small in my own home. She said pain like ours had a way of convincing us we were isolated, but we weren't. Her words settled into me, warm against the cold that had taken root. For the first time since I had walked out of that house, I felt the faintest thread of connection, something tying me to a world beyond my parents' rejection. I looked around my apartment as she spoke, at the scarf on the hook, the tin of cookies still on the counter, the blinking lights in the window. It all looked fragile but real, like a space that was mine no matter how small. When we finally hung up, I sat with the phone in my lap, the quiet of the room returning. The ache in my chest had not left, but it felt less suffocating. I leaned back against the headboard, whispering to myself that Nora was right, that I didn't have to carry this alone. The thought didn't erase the wound, but it reminded me it was survivable. And as much as it still hurt, knowing I wasn't the only one gave me a kind of strength I hadn't known I needed. The phone rang the next morning while I was making coffee, the sound sharp in the stillness of the apartment. I almost let it go to voicemail, but when I saw the name on the screen, my chest tightened. Grandma Helen. Her voice came through, warm but strong, that Wisconsin lilt I had known since childhood. She said she had been thinking of me yesterday and wanted to hear my voice. I hesitated, my fingers wrapped around the edge of the counter. Part of me wanted to lie, to say everything had been fine, that Christmas had been what it should be. But something in her tone, steady and insistent, made me set the mug down and tell her the truth. I said it had been unbearable. I told her about the way everyone celebrated Olivia, how Dad cut me off when I tried to share my art show, how Mom laughed like I was a child putting on a play. My voice shook when I told her the worst part, Dad saying they regretted having a 3rd child, the words so calm and clear. It was as if he had been waiting to say them aloud. Silence filled the line for a moment. Then Helen's voice came low and fierce, more forceful than I had ever heard. She said Daniel had been cold since he was a boy, and Margaret had always been dazzled by appearances, but she never thought they would speak such cruelty to their own daughter. She said favoritism had been clear for years, but she had prayed it would soften with time. I pressed the phone to my ear, biting the inside of my cheek as tears welled again. Hearing her anger lit something inside me, a validation I hadn't known I needed. She said she had watched Olivia being placed on a pedestal and Ethan praised for every small success while I had been left to the shadows. She told me it had always made her ache, but she had tried not to interfere, hoping my parents would come to their senses. I told her they never did that. Every holiday felt like a reminder of where I stood. I confessed that I had promised myself I would not go back. My voice wavered when I said it, as if I needed her permission to make it final. Helen was quiet for a breath before she answered. She said she wanted me to know something she had kept for years. She shuffled away from the phone, and I heard the rustle of a drawer opening. When she came back, her voice softened. She said she was holding a card I had written when I was 10. My knees bent, and I sank into the kitchen chair, my hand gripping the phone tighter. She read the words aloud, her voice trembling. "I will try harder so Mom and Dad will be proud." The words echoed back to me, not as faded ink on paper, but as a memory of that night. I remembered sitting at her dining table with construction paper and markers, Olivia upstairs with her friends Ethan playing video games with Dad. I had written it quickly, hoping she would show it to them. Instead, she must have tucked it away. She said she had kept it because she knew one day I might need proof that what I felt was real, that the longing and the pain had been written down in my own hand long before I was grown. Her voice cracked as she told me she wished she had said something sooner, wished she had shielded me better. I pressed the heel of my hand to my forehead, the tears spilling freely now. I told her I was glad she had kept it, that knowing she saw me even then meant more than I could explain. She told me I had always mattered to her, to the world, even if my parents were too blind to see it. The coffee had gone cold on the counter, but I didn't care. I sat there with the phone pressed against my ear, listening to her steady breathing, letting her words wrap around me like the blanket I never got from the people who should have given it first. Before we hung up, she said she wanted me to promise one thing. She asked me not to let their words define the rest of my life. She said regret belonged to them, not to me. I closed my eyes and whispered that I would try. When the call ended, the apartment was silent again, but it no longer felt so empty. The image of that card written in my 10-year-old scrawl glowed in my mind like a small lantern. Proof that my pain had roots, and proof that someone had cared enough to keep it safe. I sat at the kitchen table long after the call ended, my fingers tracing circles against the wood grain, my thoughts tumbling backward into years I had tried to forget. Memories pressed at the edges, each one waiting to be acknowledged, each one demanding to be felt. I saw Olivia at 18 standing in the driveway with a wide grin as Dad handed her the keys to a brand new silver sedan. A giant red bow rested on the hood, the kind you only saw in commercials. The whole family had gathered, neighbors even stopped by clapping and taking pictures. I stood on the porch holding the camera, snapping photos of Olivia sliding behind the wheel, Mom beaming beside her. No one asked me to come closer. No one said the gift was a family effort. I had smiled anyway, clapping along, swallowing the ache that sat heavy in my chest. Then came Ethan at 19, acceptance letters spread across the dining table like trophies. My parents circled him, bragging about scholarships, but when he admitted tuition would still be steep, Dad promised they would handle the rest. I remember sitting quietly with my own stack of community art class flyers, wondering if I should ask for the $100 fee to be covered. I never did. The memory of Dad patting Ethan on the back, telling him not to worry about a dime, stayed etched in my mind. I rubbed my arms now as if I could shake off the sting, but more memories followed. The year I won the statewide art competition, my watercolor of the Mississippi River chosen out of hundreds. I had walked into the living room, certificate in hand, cheeks flushed with pride. Dad barely looked up from his laptop. He muttered that it was nice, but just a hobby, nothing to build a life on. Olivia had been on the phone with a friend, already laughing about her debate team's victory. Mom sitting beside her, nodding proudly. My paper certificate drooped in my hand until I slipped it quietly into my backpack. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the blinking lights in my apartment window. Each flash seemed to illuminate another moment, another reminder that I had never been the child they invested in, never the one they saw as worthy. Christmas mornings, where Olivia's gifts sparkled with jewelry, and Ethan's piles of electronics stacked high, while mine were sweaters a size too big or art supplies from the clearance shelf. Birthdays, where my cake came from the grocery store bakery while Olivia's was custom, ordered her name piped in elegant script. The flood of memories tightened around me until it felt hard to breathe. I pressed my palms against the table, grounding myself, forcing the air back into my lungs. I thought of the times I had convinced myself it was fine, that I was different, that art was enough to fill the space where approval should have been. But looking back, it was clear I had been trying to plant roots in soil that was never meant to nurture me. The ache in my chest deepened sharper than the night before. Each memory layered on the next, building a wall of proof I could not ignore. It was not one careless word at dinner or one glass shattered on the floor. It had been years of erasure. Years of being told without words that I was not enough. I pressed my forehead against my folded arms, letting the tears come. They rolled hot and fast, soaking into the fabric of my sleeve. I whispered into the quiet, admitting what I had always feared. I had never been seen, not the way I wanted, not the way I needed. The clock on the wall ticked softly, steady against my ragged breath. My mind wandered to the photo wall in the hallway of their house, the empty space where my graduation picture once hung. It was not just the photo that had been removed. It was me. Piece by piece, memory by memory, I had been lifted out of the frame of their lives. I sat up slowly, wiping my cheeks with both hands, trying to steady myself. The silence of the apartment wrapped around me, but unlike before, it no longer felt suffocating. It felt like truth. Harsh, undeniable, but real. I knew then that Grandma Helen had been right. The favoritism had always been there, and it had left marks, deep ones I had carried all this time, even when I told myself I was fine. The weight of it all pressed down until the only thing I could do was sit there and accept it. The memories would not leave. The pain would not vanish, but at least now I could see it for what it was. And as the lights blinked softly in the window, I let myself sit with the truth that I had never been recognized, never truly been celebrated. That realization cut deeper than any words spoken at the dinner table, because it stretched back through every year of my life. The phone rang late that afternoon while I was curled up on the couch with a blanket, trying to push the memories back into the corners of my mind. I almost ignored it, but when I saw the caller ID, my brow furrowed. Robert Moore. My dad's cousin. A man I had only spoken to a handful of times at reunions and funerals, always polite but distant. I answered hesitantly, my voice catching as I said hello. His tone was steady, formal, but kind, the way I remembered. He said he had heard something about Christmas from Helen, that she had called him after speaking with me. He wanted to check in to make sure I was all right. I felt my chest tighten at the mention of my grandmother. She must have been worried enough to reach out to break the silence of years. I told Robert I was fine, though the words sounded brittle even to my own ears. There was a pause. Then he said he remembered something from years back, something that had been on his mind ever since Helen spoke. He asked if I recalled being 15, the year my parents had called him about a debt they were struggling with. I closed my eyes, the memories surfacing in pieces. I remembered overhearing hushed conversations about credit cards, late fees, threats of collectors. I remembered my mom crying quietly at the kitchen table, bills spread around her like fallen leaves. Robert said he had been asked to review some documents for them, to give advice on how to manage the situation. He remembered my dad mentioning that I had offered to help. He told me he still had the papers in his files tucked away with signatures and notes. He said my name was written, clearly listed as having contributed a sum of money to help cover part of the debt. The breath caught in my throat. I remembered the envelope I had slipped across the table that summer, money I had saved from babysitting, art commissions, odd jobs I had scraped together. It had been nearly $2,000, everything I had. I remembered the look on my dad's face, a mix of surprise and irritation, as if I had embarrassed him by offering. My mom had taken it quickly, saying it would help, promising they would pay me back someday. They never did. They never spoke of it again. Robert's voice was calm, but I could hear the disbelief beneath it. He said he had assumed it must have been acknowledged, that surely my parents had thanked me, that surely it had been remembered. He said he was stunned to hear from Helen that they had acted as though I had never contributed, as though my sacrifices had been invisible. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, my heart thudding painfully. The memory grew sharper, each detail cutting through. The smell of the bills on the table, the feel of the envelope in my hand, the way I had told myself, maybe this would finally prove I was part of the family. Maybe they would see I could carry weight too. Instead, it had been erased, buried like so many other moments. My voice cracked when I asked Robert why he had kept the papers. He said it was habit, that as a lawyer he kept records of everything, even small matters. But then he softened, saying he supposed part of him had wanted to keep proof of my character. He said even then he had seen how different I was, how I carried more than my share without complaint. The tears came hot and fast, spilling down my cheeks before I could stop them. I told him they had never said a word, since that summer never mentioned it, never repaid a single dollar. I told him it had felt like I had thrown the money into a well, hoping for an echo that never came. Robert sighed heavily, the weight of years pressing into the sound. He said he was sorry that he wished he had spoken up sooner. He said, I deserved more than silence, more than being erased from my own story. When the call ended, I sat on the couch with the phone in my lap, staring at the blinking light on the Christmas string by the window. My chest ached, but it was not just from the rejection of last night. It was from the realization that even my sacrifices, the times I had tried to carry them with my own 2 hands, had been wiped clean. It was not only love that had been denied me, it was acknowledgement of everything I had given. I pressed my palms against my eyes, letting the tears soak into the skin, and whispered into the empty room that I had been erased twice. First as a daughter, then as someone who had given all she had to be worthy. The truth settled over me like snow, heavy and quiet, and I knew nothing about my parents' house could ever hold me again. A week after Christmas, the Pierce house had gone strangely quiet. The lights still blinked in the windows at night, but they seemed more like reminders than celebrations. Margaret moved from room to room, with a box under her arm, taking down garlands, folding tablecloths that still carried faint stains of wine. The smell of roasted turkey had long since left the walls, replaced by the faint must of pine needles drying on the tree. Daniel sat at the dining room table with his tablet propped up, scrolling without really reading. The silence between them was louder than any argument could have been. He asked once if Hannah had called, though his tone was flat, more a routine question than true concern. Margaret shook her head, lips pressed thin, and kept moving. She decided to store away the holiday linens in the cedar chest at the end of the hallway. When she lifted the lid, she found the usual pile of scarves and blankets stacked neatly from years of use. But tucked beneath a folded green wool scarf was something unexpected. A spiral-bound notebook, edges frayed, cover worn soft from years of being opened and closed. She frowned and pulled it free, holding it in her hands as if it were fragile. The name scrawled across the first page stopped her cold. Hannah. She carried it to the table, setting it in front of Daniel. He adjusted his glasses, looking down at it without touching. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air felt charged the way it does before a storm. Margaret slid into a chair and opened the cover. The first entry was dated 2010, written in uneven purple pen. She read it aloud in a whisper. I wish Mom and Dad would see me. Someday I will make them proud. Her breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Daniel, but his jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the page. They turned together, the years spilling out across the paper. 2013, Hannah wrote about Olivia's new car, how she smiled for the photos though she felt invisible. 2016, she wrote about Ethan's tuition being covered, how she wished for just a fraction of the same support. 2019, she described winning a statewide art award, only to hear her father call it childish. Margaret pressed her fingers to her lips as she read each line, cutting deeper. Daniel muttered that all kids exaggerate, that she was being dramatic. But his voice lacked conviction. He kept leaning closer, scanning the words, his eyes moving faster than hers. Page after page showed Hannah growing older, her handwriting sharper, her words heavier. She wrote about sitting at Christmas dinners trying to speak and being cut off. She wrote about the empty space on the photo wall where her graduation picture had once hung. She wrote about giving them her savings to help cover a credit card debt, money never acknowledged or returned. Margaret's shoulders began to shake, but she kept turning the pages as if some part of her needed to see all of it, no matter how much it hurt. Daniel finally reached out and stopped her hand, but she shook him off and turned to the back. The final entry was dated the 25th of December, 2024. The ink was darker, pressed into the paper hard enough that the letters nearly tore through. They had told me they regret having me. I believe them. Maybe it is time I let them regret something too. Maybe they will regret never seeing their daughter for who she was. Margaret closed the book halfway, staring down at it with wide eyes. The words seemed to echo in the stillness, heavier than the silence they had grown used to. Daniel leaned back, exhaling sharply, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Neither of them spoke at first. The furnace clicked on, humming through the vents, filling the space where words should have been. Margaret whispered finally that she had no idea it had gone so deep. Daniel muttered that she must have known, that they both must have. His voice broke slightly at the end. The notebook lay open on the table between them, the pages fanned out like accusations they could not escape. Every line was undeniable, every memory dated and recorded. There was no room left to call her dramatic, no space to dismiss her as sensitive. Margaret wiped at her eyes, though the tears kept falling. She said Hannah had been hurting for years, and they had turned away every time. Daniel rubbed at his forehead, his mouth tight, but his silence was its own admission. The house that had been filled with laughter a week earlier now felt like a hollow shell. Decorations half-packed sat on the floor. The once glowing tree leaned slightly, its needles dropping one by one. The sounds of Christmas had faded, replaced by the sharp truth of their daughter's voice on paper. Margaret reached for the book again, pressing it against her chest as though holding it might bring Hannah closer. Daniel looked away, staring out the window at the snow piling against the porch steps. For the first time in years, he looked smaller, his shoulders hunched under the weight of what could not be undone. The words Hannah had left behind clung to the air long after the pages were closed. Daniel's hand trembled as he reached across the table and pulled the journal back toward him. He flipped through until his eyes caught on one page in the middle, his breath catching as he read the words scrawled in uneven lines. "I only ever wanted one photo on the family wall." His lips moved as he whispered the sentence out loud, and then his body seemed to fold in on itself. He dropped heavily into the chair, covering his face with both hands. The sound that escaped him was raw, broken sobs, tearing through a man who had built his life on control. Margaret froze in her chair, watching the man she had lived beside for decades unravel. Her own chest tightened, a sharp pain rising in her throat as she realized what he had just read. She remembered that photo, the graduation picture they had taken quickly in the yard. She remembered removing it a few years later when she redecorated the wall. She had told herself she would reframe it, but she never did. In truth, she had left it in a box in the basement until she finally tossed it out. She pressed her shaking hands to her mouth as if she could take the memory back, but it was too late. Daniel sobbed harder, his shoulders shaking. He said he hadn't known, that he never thought a simple photo could matter that much. Margaret whispered that it had not been just a photo. It had been everything. Their daughter had wanted one sign that she belonged, and they had denied even that. Her voice cracked and tears spilled down her cheeks, streaking the makeup she had not yet washed away from the holiday. The sound of the front door startled them both. Olivia stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. She called out softly that she had come to pick up a scarf she had left at Christmas. When she walked into the dining room, she stopped short. Her father was slumped over, crying into his hands, her mother pale and trembling, and a notebook lying open between them. Margaret lifted her head and told Olivia it was Hannah's journal. Her voice wavered as she explained that it held years of words they had never heard. Olivia frowned, reaching for it. She flipped through quickly, scanning pages, her brow furrowing deeper with each line. When she reached the last entry, she went silent. Her eyes moved across the ink that described Christmas night, the sentence about regret, and her hands stilled. Olivia set the notebook back down carefully, as though it might shatter. Her usual composure slipped away, her mouth opening, but no words forming. She looked at her mother, then at her father, and for once she had no smirk, no easy way out. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, the weight of guilt settling on her shoulders. The silence broke again when the door opened once more. Ethan stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He called out in his steady voice, but when he walked into the dining room, his expression changed instantly. He saw Olivia standing stiff, their mother's tears, their father collapsed, and the journal lying open. He picked it up without asking and began to read. His eyes moved quickly, his jaw tightening with every page. He flipped through years of Hannah's voice words he had never heard but now could not ignore. When he reached the final entry, his face hardened, and he slammed the book shut with a thud that made Margaret flinch. He looked straight at their parents, his voice sharp and full of fury. He demanded to know how they could let this happen, how they could say to her face that she was a regret. His voice rose as he asked what kind of parents erase their own daughter while pretending to celebrate family. Daniel tried to speak, but his voice cracked, his explanations stumbling out as fragments. He said it had been a mistake, words said without thought. Ethan shook his head, his anger spilling out in waves. He told them it wasn't one moment, it was years of moments. Years of birthdays where her gifts were smaller, years of dinners where her voice was silenced, years where Olivia was praised and Hannah was pushed aside. He admitted he had seen it and done nothing that he had stood by because silence was easier. His voice broke when he said now it was too late. Margaret sobbed harder, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if she might fall without it. She said she never meant to hurt Hannah, that she thought she was doing her best. Olivia stayed quiet, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face pale. She finally whispered that she had known too, that she had seen Hannah's hurt, but she had liked being the one in the light. Her admission hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and undeniable. Daniel dropped his head back into his hands, his sobs quieter now, but still shaking his body. Margaret turned toward him, her voice broken, whispering that they had lost Hannah. She said the words slowly, as if saying them made them real. We have lost her. The sentence filled the room, heavy and final. No one argued. Ethan lowered himself into a chair, his face buried in his hands. Olivia leaned against the wall, silent tears running down her cheeks. Margaret pressed the journal against her chest again, her fingers clutching it so tightly her knuckles turned white. The house around them, once filled with Christmas lights and music, now seemed suffocating. The ornaments still hung on the tree, but their glow looked dim. The walls echoed not with laughter, but with silence, thick and choking. In that moment, every one of them knew the truth. They had not just wounded their daughter. They had lost her completely, and there was no undoing it. The first week of January settled into quiet routines in my apartment. The decorations in the city were coming down, but the snow still blanketed everything, muffling the streets and slowing the mornings. I sat at my small kitchen table with a notebook I had bought the day before, the cover crisp and untouched. I opened to the first page, uncapped my pen, and wrote a single line. Begin for myself. The letters were firm, each stroke steady, a vow I had never made before. Beside me sat a folded letter, one I had written years ago after another argument with my parents. The words on that page had haunted me. I just want to be enough. I carried it across the room to the fire pit on my balcony. The air bit at my face as I struck a match. The flame caught quickly, curling the edges of the paper into black. I held it until the heat forced me to let go, watching the ash lift and scatter into the night wind. I whispered goodbye as it disappeared. Later that afternoon, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Helen stood there, bundled in her winter coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. She smiled softly, holding a small envelope in her gloved hand. I pulled her inside, grateful for the warmth of her presence. She said she had something she wanted me to have, something she had kept safe for many years. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a photograph. It showed me, at 4 years old, standing by a Christmas tree in her living room in Milwaukee, my hands wrapped around a stuffed rabbit, my smile wide and unguarded. The lights of the tree sparkled behind me, and for once, I was the center of the frame. Tears welled in my eyes as I traced the edges of the photo. Helen said she had kept it because she knew one day I might need to see myself clearly to remember that I had always mattered. She said she could not erase the way my parents treated me, but she could remind me of the truth. She pressed my hand and told me I had been a light in her life, even when others refused to see it. I found a small frame tucked in a drawer and slid the photo inside. I hung it on the wall above my desk, just beside the window where the winter sun streamed in. The glass caught the light, and for the first time I saw myself where I belonged, not erased, not forgotten. Helen stayed for tea, her hands wrapped around the warm mug as we talked about everything but the past. She asked about my art, about the show I had in December. I told her about the guests who had come about the newspaper write-up, and her eyes lit with pride. She said she wanted to come to the next one, no matter the weather. After she left, I sat by the photo again. The little girl in the picture beamed at me, her smile unshaken by what the years would bring. I realized I owed her something. I owed her a life where she was no longer diminished, a life where her worth was not decided by anyone else. That night I returned to my new notebook. I filled pages with sketches, ideas for paintings, words that belonged only to me. The silence of the apartment felt different now. It was not the silence of absence, but the silence of peace. I knew my parents were still in their house, surrounded by decorations they had not finished packing away, holding the weight of a journal they could never erase. Their grief was theirs to carry. Mine was no longer my burden. I looked at the scarf on the hook, at the cookies still sealed on the counter, at the photo now hanging where I could see it each day. These were pieces of my life I chose to keep. The rest I was letting go. As I closed the notebook that night, I whispered to myself that some families never change. Some wounds never get the apology they deserve. But I was no longer waiting for their recognition. I was learning to give it to myself. If you have ever felt forgotten in your own family, if you have carried the weight of being invisible, I hope you know you are not alone. Share your story, let it be heard. No one should ever have to carry silence by themselves.